everybody. My name is Harrison Wheeler, and welcome to another episode of Technically Speaking. My guest today is Dr. Cana Uluak Itchuaqiyaq, who is the Assistant Professor of Professional and Technical Writing at Virginia Tech. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Harrison. I'm glad to be here.
How's that Virginia summer treating you so far?
The moisture in the air is amazing for my skin, and I got like a layered hairdo, so it kind of does my very straight hair has some curl to it. It's amazing.
Oh,
All the
sort of
important
like,
things.
no, but like for me, like I love humid weather, right? Because I'm like, my skin is gonna be glowing once I get back to California that's dry. And, my skin always, like, usually in the fall, my skin kind of cracks. It's so dry here. So I feel you. Like there are some positive benefits to humidity.
I think the humidity is really nice. I like it, and the plant life here is so lush that
Yeah.
I like to forage, and so I notice like so many things that I'm like, I wonder if I could eat that. I wonder if I could, and so maybe there's just like all this cool, like it's a treasure trove of biodiversity in this area.
Yeah. Has like foraging always been something that you've done, or is that something you've just picked up more recently?
It is something, so I always called it something different growing up. So I'm
Yeah.
Inupiaq and I'm from Northwest Alaska, and I'm from a pretty like subsistence oriented family. So I grew up like
Mm.
our family harvested animals like on the regular, not as like a
Yeah.
cool weekend in the mountains, but as like a way of life.
Way of
And
living.
we
Yeah.
yeah, and so then we also, I guess forage would be the right word, but just like picking, like we picked greens, tagayuks, that kind of thing. I don't know if they are in English, but they're like a some kind of green plant. And then willow, little bits of like willow before they get big and bitter. And then also we pick berries, of course, and just tons of stuff. So I grew up like knowing the edible plants where I lived
Yeah.
and when to pick them. And so I carry that with me as I move around in
Yeah.
the world, and I like to learn about the local plants,
Yeah.
and I like to taste them.
Yeah. Not a
It's fun.
hobby, a way of life.
Yeah, I mean, here it's more of a hobby, right?
Yeah.
I'm not like making sure I can eat, but like at my old house when I lived in Utah for graduate school, we had a big giant lilac bush, and those are pretty slow growing, and it was
Yeah.
like giant purple and white flowers that came out nearly like around Mother's Day. So fragrant. And it's lilac has a really interesting history with like colonial structures because they were
Mm.
used to a lot to they're very hardwood, and they like were to show like property lines. So they have this
Mm.
idea of like
Wow.
divvying up the landscape. So they're like really have a strong link with colonialism in the United
Whoa.
States and elsewhere. And so I thought it was really fun to like pick lilac flowers, and we made lilac sugar out of them, just like, flavored the sugar with lilac flowers, and then also made
Yeah.
like lilac jam and syrup and such. So I like to do
Wow.
that stuff. I do that with dandelions as well. And I like medicinal plants. And so I think about those and I harvest those. I made my own flour out of some kind of roadside crunchy thing. So it's something
Some
I'm
roadside
into.
crunchy thing.
It's a dock plant, but it's like so
Okay.
it's a common weed. It's considered a weed, and
Okay.
it's really edible, just like a thistle, right? When you see the thistles on the
Got
side
it.
of the road, you're like, whoa, that's really prickly. Every part of the thistle is edible. Is it fun to eat? Maybe not so fun. But
Yeah.
is it a good experience? But is it nutritious? Yes. And so these
Yeah.
plants, these dock plants, they have these like seed pods that grow up, and they're big and brown, and there's like a zillion seeds. And so I crushed them up and I made probably the world's densest bread with it. And so I would only like if you had a cup of flour that you were supposed to put in a bread. I know there's many more cups than that, but I would probably just do like maybe a quarter of that dock flour and then the
Yeah.
rest regular flour. So yeah, I guess that's something I'm into.
It sounds like an episode of like Cooking with Cana, right? Like it could be a thing.
I even wrote about it in an academic paper.
Yeah.
So
There we
we're
go.
yeah, we wrote about how we use this app to help us identify plants because it was an area that I hadn't foraged in before, and I had a Rocky Mountain guide, but it was really hard to double check that these were the correct plants. And so it was really interesting to use this one app, and at the time it didn't account for edibility, like is it edible?
Mm,
And we were thinking about like, okay, what gets labeled weed and what gets labeled flower, what gets labeled plant,
mm,
what gets labeled these different things, and what does and then we linked it to the urge to call things decolonial and how people like to make everything you can, decolonial this, decolonial that, and to it was a way to mean like maybe non-normative or pushing back against a status quo or social justice type stuff. And so we thought a lot about like how does this like urban foraging that we were doing link
mm.
to colonial foodways, and also how does it link to the way we as scholars think about frameworks or think about what we do and the
Yeah.
impacts of like cherry picking parts of a framework or parts of a way of
Mm,
understanding something to use it for, I guess, a way to like get your stuff noticed. And so
yeah.
where does ambition cloud good practice? And so that's doesn't sound like it goes with urban foraging, but
Yeah.
it did. So
For sure. I mean, it affects sort of like the perceived value of something, and obviously a decision that you would make. But I will say this: I'm glad that you defined the crunchy roadside thing as a plant and not something else, because it could be many different things.
it's like that's a good point. You're right. That was not clear language, and I'm sure imaginations could go all over the place with that.
Yeah. So let's get into a few icebreakers. Definitely want to touch into that a little bit more as it sort of relates to some of the technical writing that you do, and then obviously sort of where you see things potentially going and opportunities. But we might have actually just touched on it, but I always ask this question to guests, like, what is something that you're currently obsessed with?
I'm obsessed with learning how to play the piano.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. How's that going?
I mean, it's a few days in, and I'm learning to play like chords so I
Okay.
can sing. And my husband plays guitar, and I play guitar too, but not as well as him. So because
Yeah.
I'm too competitive, I've bowed away from the guitar, and
Yeah.
now I'm going with the playing songs and thinking about how rhythm works on a piano because it's different.
Mm.
And so I'm obsessed with digital pianos right now
Okay.
and weighted keys and thinking through like what is the best one to get for my budget and for like what
Mm.
I think my growth as a musician might take me, which I'm
Mm.
hoping is an
I mean,
80s synth band.
are you like, I mean, is this like, small town, every Wednesday? Or are you trying to go world tour on this?
Right? No, I hate performing in front of people. I like to sing in, I mean, I'll do it, but I have like performed on stage music wise, but I have no interest in becoming anything beyond like garage band or living
Yeah.
room band,
Yeah.
singing my guts out style. But
Yeah.
I love to sing, I love to write music, and so I'm obsessed, surprisingly, with digital pianos at the moment
Yeah.
and how best to play piano for the needs I have, which is not to be like a concert, like being
Yeah.
playing whatever, or learning to even read music, and mostly just to
Yeah.
sing and play notes and chords on the piano that are really like bar that would be bar chords on a guitar, which are
Mm.
really hard for
Yeah.
me. So,
Yeah. That's awesome. I just last night actually took like a DJ lesson. And so that's probably going to be like my upset. I mean, I DJ'd, when I lived in Iowa, very casual. I did shows that people went to, but now I'm like, I should try to come back with it. Like I love it when I love it. I'm selfish. Like I love listening to music. So for one, it entertains me, but I love it when people like to listen to what I listen to.
I love that.
Okay.
Good luck
So
on your
so
DJing quest.
yes, yes, exactly. DJing quest. Maybe I can open up for one of your shows, right? How about that?
You can open up on the front porch, and the stage is the front porch.
Yeah.
The neighbors are the audience.
Yes, exactly. And be like, what is this man plan? Okay, next question. What is something that people don't talk about enough?
I think people don't talk enough about their bodies in these
Mm,
like terms that are not like as a body. Like we categorize it and put it into these like this is what this body means. But so for example, this is gonna make me sound super weird, but I'm just gonna say it. Is so last night I was watching my husband play Mario Kart, and there are these new tracks that are on the
mm,
Mario Kart. And so there's one track called In a New York Minute. I
mm.
think it was in that one. And there's these like mushroom guys like walking around, and I'm like, oh, that looks like a particular body part. And I thought to myself, that's dirty to say. But I'm like, why is it dirty to say? Because I would say the same thing as if there was like this thing that looked like an ear walking
Yeah,
around. And so I think we've like our bodies, we've applied we've added value labels to lots of it. And, even just like getting ready for this podcast, I'm like, oh, am I presentable on this part? What does this mean? Like, how does this
mm,
interact with people's meaning making of what I'm saying? And so I think people aren't talking enough about like the embodiment
mm.
that is forced upon us, and the embodiment that we have uptaken and
Yeah,
perform out for good or bad. I so much of my life would be just so much simpler if I could just accept my body as part of this organism and be able to love it in these ways that don't feel so loaded,
mm,
and also talk about it in these ways that don't feel so loaded. Because like like if I'm like, it sounds, this is gonna sound terrible, but like if I something in my armpit, let's say, like, I'm like, it's not polite to talk about armpits and ask
right.
people like, hey, does your armpit do this thing? Because it's
Yeah,
embarrassing. But then it's like, wait a
yeah.
second, but that's just the place where my arm meets my torso. Like that,
Mm,
under that, like, and what if I want to talk about that so I can like
yeah,
have my armpit optimized? I don't know what the, okay.
yeah. No, no, look, look, I get it, right? I mean, I think of it almost like of sort of like, yeah, people have created rules around what you can talk about. I think that has major implications, right? Because let's say you have a lump under your armpit, right? And you don't feel comfortable talking to someone about it, or because you're not able to articulate something in a certain way, then people refuse to listen. And, maybe, symptoms that you're having aren't ever going to be tended to because of some vernacular that someone said is only the right way to do it, right? So
Yeah, it's
there's
we
there's
regulate
some
a
effects
lot.
to that.
I think there are like, and I think there are physical ones, but then there's these like emotional ones of like, how do I move through the world, and how am I
Mm,
allowed to move through the world? What am I supposed to like? What is my posture like? What is all
mm,
these different things about how I fidget?
mm,
Like it has like meaning making on other people's
yeah,
ends, and yet we're not allowed to really talk about even the basics of our bodies, especially
yeah,
not in professional settings at all, right?
yeah,
Because then that goes into these other realms that I don't know.
right.
It's just the way I think our relationships with our bodies has forgotten that we're humans.
Mm,
And this is like my skin sac is like the boundaries of me, and help me interact with the world, and I want to be able to like talk about it. And it
yeah,
affects like design, it affects all these different things, but we are like really afraid to talk about, like, chub rub,
yeah,
right? Between like when I walk and my thighs touch each other when you gain a little
mm,
weight, like you can't acknowledge that those things exist, and that like the design of like skirts or shorts or whatever can
mm,
contribute to this like discomfort and chafing that I might have,
mm,
that I have to quietly like act as if it's not happening and walk normally.
right,
I mean, it's
right.
stuff that I think a lot about, maybe too much, but it really, I don't know. I guess the stigma of bodies is really something
Mm,
that I feel like needs to be talked a little bit more. By whom? I don't know.
yeah,
But I
yeah,
certainly like to be able to feel like not so much a weirdo, like I feel right
yeah,
now about that's the thing
yeah.
I bring up.
I mean, this is a safe space. I don't think you're weird. That all makes sense. If you want to talk about your skin sack, that's okay.
Me and my skin sack, we're traveling across the country recently,
Yeah.
noticing the humidity changing, especially around
Yeah.
Arkansas.
Yeah, look, we were for listeners, we were talking about all the places that you've lived. I'm sure there can be a separate skin sack story on all the climates from Alaska to Pleasanton to, Virginia.
My skin sack in the suburbs
Yeah.
has a different way of rolling through the world than it does in the mountains here or in the valleys.
Yes. So, hey, let's focus on you. Maybe kind of give the listeners a bit about who you are and how you got to be, an assistant professor, really kind of with a focus on technical writing, but also social justice, equitable research, and topics in those areas.
So I'm from Alaska. I'm from a village in Northwest Alaska. I'm Inupiaq, which is a particular, like a more specific way of saying Inuit. Inuit means people. Inubate is like my particular type of people where I'm from culturally, and then Inupiaq is a singular. And so I'm an Inupiaq from Northwest Alaska, and I grew up in this pretty traditional family in a lot of ways. My mom is from a little village in Northwest Alaska named Norvik, and my adopted dad, is from an island, St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea. In a little village called Savunga. And then I have a biological parent who hasn't been in my life for a long time, but they are from Germany. So
Wow.
I grew up in all these different places and having tons of privilege in lots of ways and not so much privilege in other ways.
Mm,
So, a lot of people expected because I am from Northwest Alaska that I haven't, spent a ton of time outside of that. But, I've always lived in the modern era and people there in the villages do as well. And,
yeah.
but just with different circumstances. And I had the privilege to travel a ton in my life. Like I've been all over the place. And in thinking about those opportunities, and actually end on one of those opportunities, my children's father and I, and my kids were like 12 and 14, I guess. We lived in South America and we lived in Chile and we
Mm,
bought a van again, like those Volkswagen
yeah.
van, the pop tops, and we
Yeah.
fixed it up and we drove back to the United States. And so we
Whoa.
were living in this van driving through the Atacama Desert in Chile. We'd just driven up the length of Argentina, there's a lot of desert there too. And just, it
Yeah.
was really reflective time. And, we all asked ourselves, like, we all talked about what are we going to do when we get back to the United States. And I had finished an undergraduate degree. It took me a long time to finish it and lots of false starts, but I had finished this undergraduate degree in environmental studies and I had decided I wanted to go to grad school and I was really afraid to apply
Mm,
because I had some struggles in undergraduate, but I was always a good student when I put my mind to it. So I felt like I
yeah.
could go to graduate school and so I looked into a communication degree when I got back and I wound up going to Idaho State because it was in the same town that I was living in at the time, in Pocatello, Idaho, and I worked on a master's in communication media and persuasion. And in that
Mm,
process, I thought a lot about actually of positionality. I didn't know that term yet, but I thought about performativity. Like, how do we perform gender? How do we perform a particular embodiment? And what does that do to the communication that we send out and
mm,
receive? Like, how is that a filter,
yeah.
right? Thinking through that stuff in my master's program, especially with regards to aging. I come from a
Hmm.
people, the Nupate, who are very elder driven community. So we
Yeah.
think a lot about our elders and revere elders and kind of spend our life training to be an elder, not like how people train to be a Jedi or something like that, where it's like, no, I just started Star Wars, like
Oh,
learning about Star Wars just so I can just as a way to like enjoy something that my husband really is into. So we
sure.
just started with episode one last night. So I have
Oh,
I have Jedi training on the mind.
yes.
Qui-Gon was trying to advocate for Anakin Skywalker to become
Yeah.
a Jedi.
Yeah.
So it's not like we don't have that formalized structure, but it's like this
Yeah.
idea of like how do we interact with the world and others and our cultural values? And I thought a lot
Yeah.
about that in my
Well,
master's
if
program.
you don't mind, like, what is the role of an elder?
Ooh, a role of an elder is first off a storyteller. A role of an elder is a culture keeper, knowledge keeper, but they
Mm,
do it through story and through experiential learning in those story ways. And so an elder helps people understand who they are and how they fit in with the community and to help them harness that Inupiaq spirit that we have through our values and our culture and carry that out and in, you know? And
yeah.
so an elder is, there's no formal training, but it's
Right.
something that's really important. And Western frames of aging, thinking about aging, is it's this idea of decline and
Mm,
reduced like production, where in
right.
my culture it's like increased production. It's a different type value system. And so I thought a lot about what that means and does. And weirdly, I incorporated that with horror. So I was like, I used Western frames of aging and this idea of horror films and such to like use
Okay.
aging things to express fear because that those things actually wouldn't necessarily exist in the same ways. It's very culturally laden. And so
Right.
now when I look back at that work, and as I moved towards technical communication, technical writing, professional technical communication, I, instead of just like observing what does this communication mean or do, what does being an elder mean, it's really very much like what does an elder, the practice of being an elder do, and
Mm,
how might that be integrated into systems, or how is it integrated into systems? How is it like cultural community systems? And how could it be increased, that integration be increased? How can we make sense of what's happening in Virginia by thinking about the way elders function in other communities and like, you know, using
yeah.
that as a lens. And so I think a lot about that stuff. And so I went to in my PhD program, really it all kind of turned towards social justice
Yeah.
stuff to help me get the vocabulary and the skills to work on issues facing my people versus
Mm,
using that for my learning experience, I guess is the way to say it. I chose not to focus on my own people for my dissertation work research because I just didn't, I felt clumsy is the only way to put it. And
mm.
so, and
Why did you
so
feel clumsy?
so I was just learning how to analyze stuff and also learning how
Mm,
like Western frame, like how my education is, I have a cultural education, but I also have this very Western formal
right.
education and how that acts as a worldview, sometimes
Right.
as my go-to. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to
Mm,
learn more about and challenge that more in myself as I was learning before taking that to my community
right.
and handling that preciousness of my community that really matters to
Mm,
me with these clumsy hands that really,
mm,
you know, is steeped in white saviorhood, steeped in, yeah, white saviorhood.
right.
and I didn't want to approach my community in those
Right.
frames because those are standard procedure frames and so I
Right.
needed to learn more about them, have a little more power to challenge them,
Mm,
right? With now that I'm a professor, I have that
right.
and I have the title to be like, no, actually. And so, which I didn't have as a graduate student. So I chose to abstain,
Yeah.
thoughtfully abstain from centering my community in my dissertation research
Hmm.
as an act of care.
Yeah. I mean, I find that like super fascinating, right? Because, yeah, that there's a limited English kind of vocabulary. And I just love just like you being conscious, like, hey, this might limit just all of the value that's here to basically only be read by people with a particular gaze, right? Like, so yeah, I love that. Another thing I think is like super fascinating is that like it's your collective experience and that lens that you're bringing into your education, right? And so one question I want to, well, I always ask like a level set question, right? So what exactly is technical writing and how does that show up in our lives?
Oh man, it shows up everywhere. So technical and professional communication, which takes like, it has lots of names. Technical writing, which would be like a technical writer would be like a job that people might
Mhm.
have, and professional communication is all over the place. Today, I installing a new vanity or the mirror above a vanity in my bathroom.
Mhm.
So I pull out the manual and I look
Yeah.
through, and it's writing communication that instructs action
Yeah.
is what I would say technical communication is. So at the most basic level, it's guides, instructions, recipes, right?
Mhm.
And then professional communication is like communication that helps people do their job. So in my job, I need to create a syllabus or a schedule, or I need to do certain types of writing, like grant writing and such, that allow me to be able to do my job. And so that is it at its most basic forms. But
Mhm.
when you look around your, right, you are being instructed by writing all over the place. You might
Mhm.
have a book that is like a religious in nature, right? And in
Yeah.
that book that's religious in nature, it tells you how to behave, to
Yeah.
act, right? My
Mm.
cultural system has a set of 17 codified values. Those 17 codified values teach me how to be an Inupiaq and then one day become an elder. But same thing is like how to vote, how to register to
Yeah.
vote, how to fill out a birth certificate. Like my name doesn't fit in a birth certificate. So
Mm.
my name is Cana Uluak Itchuaqiyaq. Cana is my first name, and that's great. It's a biblical name. Ulok is my tribal name, and it is in the same position as Cana culturally. Like it's like when
Yeah.
I'm home, people call me Ulok, and there's so much meaning behind the name Ulok. It talks about like my lineage, it talks about characteristics, it connects me with other people named the same thing or people who were friends with who I was named after. So it's like this huge thing. And then
Yeah.
Itchuaqiyaq is my last name, but on a birth certificate, we just have first, middle, last. And
Right.
so that middle name kind of goes into like initial mode or like,
Mm.
glossed over.
Right.
And there's no such thing as being able to like indicate my tribal name and indicate that importance on these like documents that literally regulate my identity. And
Right.
so technical communication encompasses all these different things that we do, forms we fill out, rules we have to follow, policies, but
Yeah.
also our interactions of like me asking you, Harrison, like, hey, if you were going to start a podcast, what would you start off with? And what would you
Right.
think through? And you would be like,
Right.
oh, when I did it, I did it like this. And these are the things, pitfalls. And so you're influencing my future action through that
Right.
communication. So it's a broad field, but it's a small field. and
Right. Right.
and we are very useful to lots of fields.
Yeah. Look, there's some huge implications, right, to, some of the instructional design that you're talking to. And I think, like, I've never thought of writing in that way of just, it really tells us kind of how to move through these different contexts. And so, one thing I'd want to ask you is, like, how do you make that type of writing, like, more equitable, right? Like, I think a lot of times, we think about, like, let's think about like the design process, right? I can't speak for everybody, but a lot of times the writing part is usually the last, right? And so, how do you sort of question sort of the status quo and push writing in a way that's more inclusive to sort of different circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, your question really, you know, is a great one, and it has a lot of layers. Like, what counts as writing?
Yeah.
What, like, is code writing? Because it certainly
Mm.
impacts society, right? It
Right.
is it is script. Like it is writing, and my
Right.
colleague studies, coding as writing. And I just wrote something about is citation writing, like citing people, like is that because there are choices in how we are
Yeah.
communicating what work, body of work, other people's work is in conversation with my own. So those are choices
Yeah.
that thinking about, like, but it doesn't look like writing, like once upon a time kind of, storytelling narrative stuff. But those things are writing that impact and influence society. So how do we make that more socially just, right? How do we think through that? I think that really starts with you as the the writer and understanding, number one, thinking through your own positionality and privilege, right? And how that affects your worldview, therefore your writing, and what you might value, what you might think is normal, what you might think, isn't normal, whatever it is, and
Yeah.
and how that might change in different circumstances, and also how your positionality and privilege really afford you certain power. And
Mm.
so you can, as a technical communicator or as a designer, right, can, in your sphere of influence and what you are doing as a professional, you have certain affordances, right? A margin of maneuverability. And I'm using these terms that come from scholars in my field, Rebecca Walton, Natasha Jones, and Kristen Moore. But so I just want to give them a shout out. But this margin of maneuverability allows me to do a little bit different over here, right? Now that I'm a professor and I teach science writing, I'm like, oh, I'm going to teach a socially just science writing because I can
Yeah.
say that I'm going to do that and I'm going to incorporate social justice into science writing. But in fact, when I was a graduate student, would I have the same power? If I'm an adjunct, do I have that same power, right? I'm on the tenure track, so I have a lot. It's a little harder to get rid of me. And so if
Yeah.
I don't play the game exactly right. And so understanding that margin of maneuverability that you have
Mm.
and being willing to take calculated risks depending on,
Yeah.
right, your own embodiment and what you got going on in your life to move it towards less oppressive outcomes, like thinking through,
Mm.
can this writing contribute to an oppressive outcome? Most simple example, right? You have a form, a survey you're making,
Hmm.
and you're like, oh, I want simple demographic information. And you're like, oh, how do I class gender, right?
Mm.
And nowadays, I notice heavily, right, when as somebody who's not non-binary, I'm not two-spirit, I don't know, I'm like in this thing, but I have a child that is non-binary. I notice when a form just has the binary, male, female,
Right.
right? And then I also
Yeah.
notice when it says other, and I'm like, ew. Like,
Mm.
and so those
Yeah.
those things might not give you the hurts or the feels or touch you in a way if it doesn't impact your life and touch a vector
Right.
of oppression that affects you,
Mm.
right? But being aware that just because it doesn't do it to you, that it may do it to others, and
Right.
designing things in ways that with an open heart, a good heart towards others is I guess, and
Yeah.
using that margin of maneuverability to do it is without permission, right? Don't ask permission, just do
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
so that's what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Quick question on sort of your experience, right? What has it, I mean, you're bringing in sort of this intersection of, obviously your passion for social justice, your background, your upbringing. How has that sort of played a role in pushing against the status quo, particularly in like academia? Like how's that been, and sort of like what advice would you have for folks that are trying to be more inclusive, that are also potentially like that vector of people that aren't represented, or maybe represented for the first time?
The advice that I would give people would be really build in extra time, right? Thoughtful design that has the ability for people to interact with it and, point out issues, or, you might uncover that if you build in time to adjust, right? To have these conversations prior to design, like to really think through users, right? Like what they're really coming for, and that's something I do with my work that I do in design and in interfaces and different things like that in my research. But really building in extra time, because a lot of time it's that expediency, this thing that we're like efficiency, that drives tons of oppressive structures, right? And
Mm.
because number one, we follow a path that other people have ahead of us. So we're like, oh, if the scholar that trained me, or this supervisor does it this way, then this is obviously the correct way,
Mm.
without building in time to look at that system, that
Right.
path, and go, hmm, I wonder if we just did this a little bit different, what could the results be, right? What are we
Mm.
concealing by just doing the same thing everybody's doing, what might challenging that or at least reconsidering that reveal to us about
Yeah.
new pathways, especially pathways that are recognizing colonialism, like that the colonial structures have like created the way that things happen, which really links to capitalism and really,
Yeah.
and really thinking through like, is this, yes, this might be more efficient to run it this way, but are we going to have to remediate that in the future? To like, that's the advice that you have to say. It's like, remediation is much harder than good design up
Right.
front and building in time to do good design of research
Hmm.
procedures, of how you like talk to, if you have research participants, to like reflect like, okay, I heard you saying this, is that what you meant? And then to correct you, and then not feel like you have the pressure of like that correction to be able to really incorporate that into like what you're doing so people feel heard versus
Hmm.
herded.
Right.
And so time is the biggest advice that I ask people to consider, which never works for academic time clocks, never works for, capitalist production in the industry, never works for all these
Yeah.
things. But when you have work that's centered on relationships, if you don't build time into listening, then how can you expect people to tell you what's really happening
Hmm.
in a way that has trust in that? And how can we change things? So challenging colonial notions of time is really what
Yeah.
I advise anybody to do when wanting to do good
Yeah.
design.
Yeah. Well, I that was some amazing advice. We are gonna close up on the show because we're almost. I don't know how we got the time so quick.
I talk so much
Um,
and so quick.
but you have it did happen. It happened really quick. Honestly, I was like, whoa. But you have a ton of work out there. Are there any particular works that our listeners should maybe check out, like whether it be around decolonialization, writing? Got a lot. So are there any that stick out to mind, and where might folks be able to access that?
So you can look me up on Google Scholar. I try to keep that in the Orchid ID stuff. I try to keep that
Hmm.
up, but I realize not everybody has the opportunity to find publications behind a paywall. And that's something I'm working on with my research, is thinking through rematriation of knowledges back to the people. But so if you see something that you're really interested in reading but don't have access to, like an academic library, for example, if you're a practitioner or such, or just curious citizen, feel free to contact me via my website. There's a contact form. It's itchuaqiyaq.com. It's so you're gonna just look at the show description to get the spelling, but it's my
Yeah,
last
it
name
will
dot
it will
com.
all be in the show notes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you can contact me there. I haven't updated in quite a while about projects that I'm doing, but one project that I'm really proud of is a collaborative project that I'm working with my tribe. Actually, my sister, who
Wow.
is the director of operations for the cultural arm, the nonprofit cultural arm of my tribe. And I'm also working with some amazing scholars at Virginia Tech. And we're doing this project called the Rematriation Project. And we are really deconstructing and thinking through archives. And
Mm.
as a way to bring cultural rematriation is a little different than repatriation, but it's about bringing cultural items back. So things that are now behind the academic paywall that came from my ancestors and people to, help with disciplines like Arctic studies, for example. And so bringing those back to our people, but also creating mechanisms for local collections to be able to be housed online somewhere, and really empowering local communities to be doing community archive work like a scanner and a Google Sheet, and being able to,
Yeah.
and making guides for people to be able to really record our history in a way that the data, that thinks about data sovereignty and thinks about that.
Yeah.
So I can give you a link to the Rematriation Project. We have just a very basic website at this point because we're just planning, but it's a really
Yeah.
cool project that I'm very, very proud of. And it's a lot of good people working together on that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Chakyuk, thank you so much for joining, technically speaking, and really excited about your projects and just kind of keeping up with you. Your voice is extremely important. And I know this isn't, the category of show that you're always on, but I think, your stories and your thought process is really important to help inspire the listener. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me today. I hope that something I said is helps somebody with whatever they're trying to do.